On the night of September 21st, 2013, 39-year-old Joe Connell clinked his fork against a champagne glass to get the attention of his friends and family, who were sitting together on a restaurant patio in Wilmington, Delaware. Everyone at the large table quieted down as Joe stood up and raised his glass. He looked over at his wife Olga sitting right by him, and he smiled at her. Then he cleared his throat and made a toast. He said that he still couldn't believe that he'd been lucky enough to meet and marry a beautiful, brilliant woman like Olga, and he was so excited to be there with the people they loved to wish her a happy 39th birthday. Everyone at the table shouted happy birthday, toasted Olga, and then drank their champagne. Olga blushed, and Joe laughed a bit. He knew how shy his wife could be when the attention was on her. But he sat down and put his arm around her and told her that she deserved all the attention. After all, this was her special day. A few minutes later, as the group was talking and eating, Joe felt his phone buzz in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw there was a text message. He read it, then quickly replied, and then jumped back into the conversation at the table. But pretty much right away, loud music began playing from inside the restaurant, and Olga immediately got excited. The music meant that the dance floor in this large restaurant and bar was now open, and the dance floor was one of the big reasons they'd chosen this place to celebrate here in the first place. Because as shy as Olga was in a lot of social situations, she actually loved to let loose and dance. And so Joe instinctively stood up, looked over at his wife and took her hand, and then together they walked inside the restaurant. Once inside, they immediately hit the dance floor, and for a minute, Joe just stood there watching his wife dance. She had beautiful blonde hair, she was wearing a nice dress, and she had on sparkling pieces of expensive jewelry. Joe had meant every word in his short birthday toast. He really couldn't believe how lucky he was to be married to this woman. The couple had met online about 3 years earlier, when Joe was just coming out of the craziest and most difficult period of his life. Joe had gotten into this drunken brawl and ended up pulling out a gun, and the police got involved. Joe had said the gun was not loaded, but that event still had landed Joe in prison for almost 6 years. And when he'd gotten out, he'd vowed to clean up his life. And pretty quickly after getting out, 2 things made that possible. 1, he'd become co-owner of an auto repair shop with his best friend Chris, and 2, he'd met Olga. Joe and Olga had gotten along right away, and so they quickly set up a date. And as soon as they hung out in person, Joe thought Olga was the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen, and one of the smartest people he'd ever met. Olga had grown up in Russia, and while she was there, she'd received college degrees in physics and chemistry. Now, Joe never thought of himself as being a particularly smart guy. He thought he was just a really good car mechanic. But Olga, she fell for him the same way he fell for her. She thought he was funny and outgoing, and it didn't hurt that she thought he was handsome and in great shape. And so, not long after their initial meeting, they moved in together, and then eventually, in June of 2013, they got married, just a few months before Olga's 39th birthday. Back on the dance floor, Joe shouted over the loud music and told his wife how amazing she looked tonight. Olga wrapped her arms around his neck, and they started dancing together. And before they knew it, hours had flown by. The dance floor had all but cleared, and the restaurant staff was now starting to shut things down for the night. Joe and Olga said goodbye to the few friends who'd stayed to dance with them, and then they too left the restaurant. On the drive home, Joe and Olga talked and laughed, still wired from their night out. But at one point, Joe got this sad look on his face, and Olga asked if something was wrong. Joe shook his head and said he was just sorry that his little sister Kelly hadn't been at the party. Olga didn't say it, but she knew that Kelly hadn't just missed the party. Kelly had not been invited. Because Joe and his younger sister were in the middle of a full-on feud, and they had completely stopped talking to each other. And as much as it upset Joe not to have Kelly in his life anymore, he could not bring himself to reconcile with her. But Olga didn't want anything to spoil her perfect birthday, so she quickly changed the subject. And within a few minutes, Joe was laughing again. Around 1:30 a.m., Joe pulled his car into a parking spot in front of his and Olga's condo. Olga got out of the car and headed down the walkway towards their front door. Joe moved kind of slowly and trailed behind her. Olga pulled her keys out of her purse, and right as she was about to unlock the door, she heard a strange noise coming from behind her. Not long after that, Officer Kelly Richards of the Newcastle County Police Department got out of her cruiser and headed up the walkway towards Joe and Olga's condo. Just a few minutes earlier, emergency dispatch had been flooded with calls from people in the surrounding condos saying they had just heard gunshots, and one caller had been sure he could see a body. Richards was the first cop on the scene, but she saw paramedics crouched down by the front door of the condo, furiously trying to help someone who was on the ground. Richards approached, and she saw there was an unconscious blonde woman in a dress laying there. Blood was pouring from the woman's cheek and head onto the concrete, and Richards thought it looked like she'd been shot. The woman was still breathing though, but just barely. Richards saw there was a ring with several diamonds in it on the woman's finger. So Richards' first thought was that the attacker must not have been here to rob this woman. Officer Richards saw more paramedics rushing down the walkway with a gurney, so she moved out of the way. But as Richards watched the paramedics wheel this woman to a nearby ambulance, she realized something strange. Richards knew this woman. Suddenly, Officer Richards looked around and really took in the condo and the surrounding area, and then it hit her. This woman, who was being rushed to the hospital, was Olga Connell. Less than 2 months earlier, Officer Richards had worked a burglary case at this condo because someone had broken in and stolen a bunch of Olga's expensive jewelry. Just then, Richards heard cars screech to a stop in the parking lot, and it sort of snapped her out of her daze. She saw several police officers coming her way, looking at her expectantly, and she told them they needed to do a sweep of the area. And it didn't take long before Richards heard one of the officers calling her name. She saw the officer crouching down near some bushes a few yards away from the front door, and so Richards walked over and joined the officer. And there, half hidden by the bushes, she saw the body of a man who had been shot multiple times, and it was clear he was already dead. Officer Richards knelt down and shined her flashlight to get a clear look at the man's face, and right away, she recognized him too. This was Olga's husband, Joe. Officer Richards had met with him several times during that burglary investigation. Around this time, Officer Richards looked over and saw the lead investigator, Detective Jamie Leonard, getting out of his car. Richards got up and walked over to him, but before she could say anything, Detective Leonard told her that he'd just gotten news that the woman who'd been found at the scene here had died on the way to the hospital. So they were now dealing with what looked like a double homicide. Officer Richards said she knew both victims. Their names were Olga and Joe Connell, and their condo had actually been robbed back in July. But Richards said that wasn't all. While the police had never arrested anyone in connection with that robbery, Joe Connell had suspected he knew who robbed them. And police had even interviewed this person. It was Joe's own little sister, Kelly. That afternoon, Detective Leonard sat at his desk looking over crime scene photos, waiting for Joe's sister, Kelly, to get to the station. And as he looked at photos of Olga laying by the front door and Joe laying several yards away in the bushes, he had a theory that he just couldn't shake. Leonard had spent the entire morning with Officer Richards and a few others combing the area around the condo, and a couple of things had stood out to him. The first was that the bushes where Joe's body had been found were littered with 9mm bullet casings. However, they also found .22 caliber casings on site, and the report Leonard had received from the hospital where Olga had been taken stated that her bullet wounds had come from a .22. Now, Leonard knew it was possible that the killer could have just had two different guns on them. But based on how far apart the bodies had been found, he thought it was more likely that there had been two shooters at the scene, one to kill Olga and one to kill Joe. And if that was the case, Leonard thought there was a good chance that these murders had been planned, and that they were not the result of some kind of spur-of-the-moment argument or anything like that. Detective Leonard's door opened, and an officer stepped inside. He told Leonard that Joe's sister Kelly had just arrived and was waiting in one of the interview rooms. Leonard put the crime scene photos back in a folder, put on his suit jacket, and then walked out of his office. Detective Leonard reached the interview room, went inside, and sat down at a table across from Kelly. And right away, his first impression was she looked like she hadn't slept all night. Joe and Olga's immediate families had all been informed about the murders, but since Olga's family was in Russia, Joe's parents and his two siblings were the ones dealing directly with the police. And Leonard knew that could take a toll on someone. So he started the interview with what he thought was a simple question. What was Kelly's relationship with her brother Joe like? But just hearing this question sent Kelly into a total breakdown. She began sobbing and she struggled to catch her breath. She said that she and Joe had actually been fighting and had stopped talking to each other. But now he was dead, and so she'd never get a chance to talk to him again. Detective Leonard just sat there quietly and let Kelly cry for a few minutes. As far as he could tell, Kelly was truly upset about the death of her brother. But Leonard also knew that didn't necessarily mean she was totally innocent. When Kelly finally composed herself and said she was okay to continue, Detective Leonard laid everything out. He told her he knew about the burglary at Joe and Olga's condo, and he knew she, Kelly, had been interviewed by police in connection to that crime. He also assumed that that's why she and her brother had stopped talking to each other. But Kelly said no, that her and Joe had actually started fighting before all that. And then Kelly leaned forward and began telling her story. And as she did, Detective Leonard just sat there thinking, this sounds totally insane. Kelly told the detective that years ago, her mother had given her the most beautiful ring with a bunch of diamonds in it. The ring was a family heirloom, and her mom had wanted to pass it on to her only daughter. Kelly had treasured this ring and dreamed of it being her engagement ring someday. Then, a few months ago, Kelly's mother had asked if she could borrow the ring so she could wear it on a trip she was taking. Kelly said of course. After all, it had been her mother's ring for a long time before Kelly got it. However, when her mom had returned the ring, Kelly knew right away that something was wrong. The ring looked different. So, on a hunch, Kelly had brought the ring to a jeweler, and the jeweler said there were no diamonds in this ring. There were only cubic zirconias. Cubic zirconias are cheaper stones that are often used to imitate diamonds. Kelly told Detective Leonard that she'd been really confused at first. But pretty soon, everything clicked when she heard that Joe had given Olga this beautiful engagement ring with several diamonds in it. And so Kelly got in touch with Olga, wanting to know if those diamonds had come from her family heirloom ring. Olga had said she had no idea what Kelly was talking about, but it hadn't taken long for Kelly to get her mom and Joe to admit what they had done. They had taken the diamonds out of Kelly's ring when she lent it to her mother, put those diamonds in a new ring for Olga, and put cubic zirconias in the original, gave it back to Kelly, and just hoped Kelly wouldn't notice. At this point, Kelly stopped talking. And at first, Detective Leonard really didn't know what to say. This was like the plot twist of a heist movie or something. But he quickly got back on track. He asked point blank if Kelly had broken into Joe and Olga's condo to try to steal the diamonds back, or to steal other jewelry to get back at Joe for what he'd done. At this point, Kelly broke down again. She said she had nothing to do with the burglary. And as angry as she was, Joe was still her brother, and she loved him. Leonard wrapped up the interview by asking Kelly where she had been when Joe and Olga had been killed. And Kelly said she'd been home alone. She knew that was not a great alibi, but it was the truth. After the interview ended, Leonard considered Kelly to be a major suspect. But he didn't have any concrete evidence to hold her, so he had to let her go. The detective had not slept in a while, but he had no intention of stopping anytime soon. And after Kelly's crazy story, he wanted to talk to someone outside of the family about Joe, someone who would not have been mixed up in the family feud and who hadn't swiped any diamonds. So Leonard headed across town to Joe's auto repair shop. Later that afternoon, still not even 24 hours after Joe and Olga's bodies had been found, Detective Leonard walked across the parking lot of the auto repair shop that Joe had co-owned. He saw several mechanics hard at work on different cars, and he also saw a few guys who looked like they'd just come by the shop to hang out. They seemed a little strange to Leonard, but he didn't think too much about it. He walked into a small lobby, and he saw a man who looked like he was around 30 sitting behind the counter. Detective Leonard introduced himself and showed his badge, and the man behind the counter stood up. He said his name was Chris Rivers, and he asked if there was a problem. Leonard asked him if he knew who Joe Connell was. Immediately, Chris let out a big sigh, and a very annoyed look came across his face. He looked right at Leonard and said, "What did he do now?" This was not what the detective had expected. In fact, it really threw him off. Leonard had planned to come by the shop, learn a bit about Joe, and then leave. But now, he wondered if Chris might have information about something illegal Joe had been mixed up in. So, right there on the spot, Leonard changed his plan, and he asked Chris if he wouldn't mind coming to the station to answer some questions. The sun had begun to set by the time Detective Leonard and Chris sat down together inside of an interview room. Based on what Chris had said at the auto repair shop, it seemed like he had no idea Joe had been killed, and Leonard didn't tell him. Instead, the detective asked Chris what he did at the auto repair shop. Chris said he co-owned the place with Joe, but sometimes he felt like he was doing everything by himself. Leonard asked him to elaborate, and so Chris said, Joe seemed to like the idea of owning the business way more than actually running the business. Leonard smiled like he could relate, and he asked Chris if Joe's behavior upset him. Chris said of course it did. It was hard enough keeping the shop open, let alone profitable. But suddenly, Chris stopped talking and just stared at Detective Leonard. Chris realized he'd just started ranting and still had no idea why he was there. So he asked again, what had Joe done? At this point, Detective Leonard knew he had to tell Chris what was going on. So he said Joe hadn't done anything. Instead, someone had murdered Joe and his wife. Everything about Chris's demeanor immediately changed. His face went blank and he looked kind of pale. He started shaking his head. He said there was no way. Joe couldn't be gone. But Leonard said it was true. And right away, Chris got mad at himself. He couldn't believe he'd just trashed his best friend like that because of some stupid work stuff. Just like Leonard had done with Kelly, he let Chris sit there for a while and collect himself. Then at some point, when there was a lull, the detective asked Chris when the last time he had seen Joe was. Chris said he had seen Joe the day before at work. But after he said that, Chris suddenly paused like something had just hit him. He told Leonard somewhat emotionally that he was actually supposed to go to Olga's birthday party the night before, and he had gone to the restaurant, but when he was outside, he realized he had left his wallet back at the shop. He was already feeling annoyed that he'd had to work late, so instead of going to the party and seeing his friends one last time, he had just bailed, gotten his wallet, and headed home. And now he felt really bad about it. And so Detective Leonard asked a few follow-up questions about Chris's relationship with Joe and with Olga and how they met each other and things like that. And then eventually, Detective Leonard said he had just one more question for the time being. He asked Chris, when they had first met, why had he assumed Joe had done something that would have gotten him in trouble with the police. Chris took a breath and then said he had never told anyone this, but he knew that Joe was a big-time illegal steroid user. That's how he stayed in such great physical shape. However, Chris said over the past several months, Joe had gone from just using steroids to dealing them. In the days following the interview with Chris, Detective Leonard really started to dig into Joe's past, particularly his time in prison. Leonard and his team met with prison staff and people who'd been on the inside with Joe, and a lot of them said the same thing. When Joe was in prison, he had become very good friends with his cellmate, who was a member of a motorcycle gang called the Pagans. And Detective Leonard knew all about the Pagans. They were directly connected to the drug trade in Wilmington and in cities across the East Coast. So he wondered if maybe Joe had gotten mixed up with the gang after he had gotten out. Maybe he had made them angry, or took too much money on a drug deal and they retaliated. So Leonard methodically tracked down members of this gang and asked them if Joe Connell had been dealing drugs for them. Now, most of the members admitted to knowing Joe, but getting any information beyond that proved to be very difficult. This didn't surprise Leonard, because drug-dealing members of motorcycle gangs were not really known for talking to the police. But at the end of September, so about a week after the murders, Detective Leonard was sitting at his desk when an officer walked in with a strange look on his face. The door opened wider, and this huge, intimidating guy in a black leather jacket walked inside. And Detective Leonard couldn't believe it. because this man was one of the leaders of the pagans. The leader sat down and told the detective that he was not there to try to protect himself or anybody in the biker gang. He was just there to set the record straight. He said that Joe had been a very good friend, and he was still shocked that somebody had killed him, but he told the detective that Joe had absolutely nothing to do with any drug deals the pagans might be involved in. Joe was just a great mechanic who loved riding and working on motorcycles. Now, Detective Leonard knew how utterly bizarre it was that this man had 1. Chosen to set foot in the police station, 2. Actually speak to a detective, and 3. Not even try to hide the fact that he had connections to the drug world. And so by the time this leader left, Leonard couldn't help but feeling like he must be telling the truth. Still though, the detective was not ready to just drop the drug lead altogether. Leonard did think Joe's sister Kelly was still a major suspect, but Olga had been wearing her diamond ring when she was found, so this being some kind of a drug-related hit, as opposed to a robbery attempt, made more sense to him. And soon, as his team kept looking into Joe's past, they found a new drug-related lead. That lead was a man named Josh Bay. Josh was a known drug dealer in town, and he had even worked as an FBI informant. But for Detective Leonard, the most important thing about Josh was that he seemed to spend a lot of his free time just sort of hanging out at Joe's auto repair shop. On October 4th, 2 weeks after the murders, Detective Leonard brought Josh Bay in for an interview. But it quickly became clear that this young man was not going to be all that helpful. In fact, Josh at first tried to play off that he didn't even know Joe or his business partner Chris. When Leonard pointed out that police had plenty of evidence that said he did know both men, Josh simply changed his story. He admitted he knew Joe and Chris, but only as the guys who worked on his car. Leonard pressed Josh, but it got him nowhere. Josh said he knew nothing about drug deals involving anyone at the auto shop, and he said he had no connection to Joe and Olga's murders. The detective didn't really believe anything Josh said, but he'd have to find proof that Josh was lying. So Leonard let him go, frustrated that he had good leads, but no clear evidence pointing to any of them. The following day, October 5th, Detective Leonard and members of his team stood at the back of a church for Joe's funeral, listening to a man sing Danny Boy over Joe's casket. As Leonard listened to the song, he scanned the church pews, looking at everyone who had come. And one thing stood out. Most of Joe's friends and family clearly believed Joe's sister Kelly was involved in the murders. Because nobody was speaking to Kelly. It was like the entire family was shunning her. Even though Leonard had leaned into Joe's potential drug connections over the past weeks, he had not crossed Kelly off his suspect list by any means. If she wasn't the one who had pulled the trigger, she could have helped plan the hit. And maybe she didn't want to rob Olga's diamond ring or her other jewelry because she knew that would lead police right back to her. So, standing there in the church, watching Kelly stand there uncomfortably, Detective Leonard wondered if maybe the murders were just a classic case of revenge. Four days later, on the evening of October 9th, Detective Leonard and his team gathered around a TV at the station to watch a local news show. This was not something they did often, but tonight, the news was running a story on Joe and Olga that would include interviews with people who had been close to the couple. Just like going to the funeral, Detective Leonard saw this as an opportunity to see if anyone would say or do something strange. The news show started, and at first it was pretty standard. A retrospective on Joe and Olga's lives and how much people love them. But during one interview segment, Leonard heard something that took him completely by surprise. He looked around at his team to make sure he hadn't misheard something, but they had all caught it too. And they knew it could be something huge. After the news show ended, Leonard didn't waste any time. He laid out a new strategy to pursue what he thought might be the most important lead they'd gotten since the night of the murders. Leonard's team worked tirelessly, but it would still take a lot longer than Leonard had hoped for them to secure enough concrete evidence to put together a case that would hold up in court. But in September of 2014, 1 year after the murders, police finally made an arrest. Now they had a clear picture of who killed Joe and Olga and how they pulled it off. Based on details from that news show, evidence found at the crime scene, and interviews conducted over the course of a year, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened outside of Joe and Olga's condo in the early morning of September 22nd, 2013. Around 1 a.m., the killers pulled their car into the condominium parking lot. They wore all black clothes and black gloves. The driver lifted their shirt, pulled a 9mm handgun from their waistband, and checked to make sure it was loaded. The passenger did the same with their .22. The killers scanned the parking lot and the surrounding area. It was well lit, but it was clear. Nobody was there. The driver nodded to the passenger, at which point the passenger stepped out of the car and quickly ran over to some bushes just a few yards away. The passenger crouched down, hid in the bushes, and kept their eyes fixed on Joe and Olga's front door. At the same time, the driver shut off the engine and sat in the car, waiting. About a half hour later, around 1:30 a.m., a car pulled into the parking lot. The driver could immediately feel themselves tense up. They looked out and saw a woman wearing a dress getting out of the car and heading up the walkway towards the front door, while a man followed shortly behind her. After a steadying breath, the driver gripped their 9mm and then stepped out of their car. And at that exact moment, right as Olga and Joe had reached the front door, the passenger leapt out of the bushes where they'd been hiding, sprinted towards Olga, and fired off 3 quick shots at her. The bullets struck Olga in the head, cheek, and upper back, and she immediately crumpled to the ground, covered in blood. Joe, who was right behind her, screamed in horror, but as he ran towards his wife, the driver unloaded their 9mm from right behind Joe. He got hit multiple times, but he actually stayed on his feet. Joe stumbled forward and tried to run to the bushes, looking for any way out of here, but the driver pursued him and kept firing their gun. Joe took rounds in the chest, arms, legs, and the back of his head. Finally, he hit the ground and died in the bushes. The driver ran back to the car and climbed inside. The passenger was already there, panting and trying to catch their breath. The driver started up the car, threw it in reverse, and peeled out of the lot. A few minutes later, when the killers were clear of the condo, the driver eased off the gas and told the passenger to let the person who had hired them know that the job was done. The 2 people who shot and killed Joe and Olga had no personal connection to them at all. They had simply been hired to do a job by Josh Bay, the drug dealer who had hung out at the auto repair shop. But Josh had also been hired by somebody else to carry out these murders. And the person who had hired Josh, and who was behind setting all of this up, was Joe's own best friend and business partner, Chris Rivers. For all of Chris's talk about Joe using and selling steroids, police discovered that it was actually Chris who appeared to have a major drug issue, with opioids and cocaine. And Chris's drug habit had begun to take a huge financial toll on him. He was basically burning through all his money. But Chris believed he had found a solution for all his problems. Chris and Joe had taken out a joint insurance policy for the auto repair business. Essentially, this policy would pay out a large lump sum to one owner and give that owner full control of the company if the other owner and any other beneficiaries died. This meant that to get the payout and to take sole control of the company, Chris would not only have to get rid of Joe, he would also have to get rid of Joe's possible beneficiary, Olga. So Chris reached out to his drug dealer, Josh Bay, for help. He offered Josh a cut of the insurance payout to murder Joe and Olga. But Josh had no intention of actually pulling the trigger himself, so he subcontracted the job out to 2 hired killers he knew from his work in the drug trade. On the night of Olga's birthday party, Chris texted Joe. He said he was finishing up something at work, but he wanted to know how late they'd be at the restaurant, because he still wanted to come to the party. Joe texted back that they would be there late, most likely until around closing time. Chris would pass that information on to Josh, and Josh would let the hired killers know so that they could be waiting at the condo when Joe and Olga got home. As Joe's business partner, Chris had been a suspect, but the bulk of the early investigation focused on Joe's sister Kelly and also on the possible drug angle with the Pagans motorcycle gang. But when Detective Leonard and his team watched the news show about Joe and Olga, they heard Chris say in an interview that on the night his two friends got killed, he had worked late and then gone straight home. This is not what Chris had originally told Detective Leonard. Chris had told Leonard that he had first driven to the restaurant for the birthday party, realized he'd forgotten his wallet, and then left and went home. This little change in Chris's story was like a massive alarm going off inside of Detective Leonard's head. So he and his team shifted their focus and dug deep into Chris's personal life and financial records, and they eventually discovered Chris's money problems, his drug habit, and his direct connection to the drug dealer, Josh Bay. Chris was charged with double homicide and found guilty, and he received 2 life sentences. Josh Bay got a plea deal and was sentenced to 5 years in prison. As for Joe's sister Kelly, despite her feud with her brother, she had nothing to do with the murders, and no evidence ever surfaced that she was at all involved in that burglary of Joe and Olga's condo. A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. In the early 1960s, 2 high school classmates in South Carolina, named Carol and Reggie, fell in love with each other. Every day in the halls, they'd hold hands and they'd laugh with each other and whisper to each other, and then outside of school, they were inseparable. But despite their seemingly perfect relationship, it didn't last long. They both had different ideas about what the future should hold, and so after graduation, they broke up. Reggie went on to join the US Navy, where he served for a number of years all over the world. He would at one point get married, but that marriage would end quickly, and then after he got out of the military, he got a job at a railroad back at his hometown in South Carolina. As for Carol, after graduation, she got married and divorced too, twice actually, but it was her second failed marriage that nearly killed her. On February 18, 1987, Carol was living with her 10-year-old daughter Rhonda in South Carolina when her estranged second husband came up to the door and knocked. Carol opened the door and her ex-husband drew a gun and shot her 6 times in front of her daughter before turning around and fleeing. The police would later find his body inside of his car on the side of the road. He had shot himself. As for Carol, the doctors were able to save her life, but the injuries she sustained from the attack were crippling. She was blind in one eye and she had chronic pain, and so her young daughter had to start taking care of her full time. Over the next 8 years, Carol steadily improved and regained some of her independence, but in 1995, she had a huge setback. She started feeling ill, and so she went in to see a doctor, and the doctor did a blood test, and they discovered she had liver cancer. It would turn out the blood that was given to her after the attack that had been transfused into her body to save her life, it had been tainted with hepatitis C. And so she got hepatitis C without realizing it, and because it had been untreated, it led to liver cancer. Rhonda remembers when her mother came home after being given this terrible news, she just sat down and was silent for a minute, and then she just kind of muttered to herself, "I just can't get away from this man. He's killing me all over again." But despite being dealt such an unfair hand in life, Carol was determined to not let her injuries or her illness define her. And so she went out looking for a job that could accommodate her physical limitations, and she found it. She was hired as a part-time customer service rep for a television cable company. She was very happy about this job and very proud of it because it was the first time she was working after the attack, and so for once it felt like her life was going back to normal again. A few years later, in 2000, when Carol was working at the cable company, her phone rang and she answered it the way she answered every other call, but the voice she heard on the other end, she immediately recognized. He introduced himself as Reggie Sumner, and so Carol asked him, "Are you the Reggie Sumner from 1962 at Garrett High School in South Carolina?" And he said, "Yeah, that's me." And Carol said, "I'm your ex-girlfriend. We dated in high school." And so it was this incredible reunion, this totally chance phone call, and for the next hour or so, they just chatted on the phone about everything from their kids to their relationships they've been in to what they're up to now. I mean, they had a lot to catch up on since they hadn't seen or heard from each other in nearly 40 years. And so before they hung up, they realized they lived near each other, and so they made plans to get together in person. Rhonda would say her mother, when she came home that night, was like a 16-year-old girl all over again. She talked endlessly about how great Reggie was and how good-looking he was and how excited she was about their upcoming date. And so a couple of days later, Carol and Reggie have this date, and when Carol comes home, Rhonda would say it was obvious her mother had fallen head over heels in love with Reggie all over again. And luckily, Reggie had fallen in love with Carol too, because less than 6 months later, they got married and became Mr. and Mrs. Sumner. Within a year of their marriage, they decided to sell their home in South Carolina and move to Jacksonville, Florida to retire. Even though caring for her mother for all those years had been quite difficult for Rhonda, she said she was very sad to see her mother go, but at the same time, she was really happy for her because it seemed like she had found the one. Over the next couple of years, Rhonda stayed in touch with her mother, speaking to her almost every single day on the phone. But in July of 2005, Rhonda's mother stopped answering her phone. At first, Rhonda wasn't that concerned, but after 24 hours of not hearing from her mother or from Reggie, she did get concerned. Because even though Reggie was able to care for Carol, he wasn't in the best shape himself. He had debilitating diabetes, and he had recently broken his leg, and so was largely confined to a wheelchair. And so if they were to leave their house for an extended period of time, they wouldn't do it without asking for help from Rhonda. And so over the next couple of days, Rhonda incessantly called her mother and called Reggie, but she never got through to them. And so finally, after almost 72 hours of not hearing from them, she decides to just hop in her car and drive the 4 hours to Jacksonville to check on them personally. When she got there, she saw her mother and Reggie's car was not in the driveway like it normally would be. And so Rhonda went up to the front door and she knocked and she's yelling for her mom, but nobody's coming to the door, even though lights are on inside the house. And so Rhonda eventually tries the handle of the door and it's open. And so she opens it up, she steps inside, she yells again for her mom and for Reggie, but no one yells back. And then she sees their beloved dog, Mikey, that they brought everywhere with them, was still in the house. And so she's thinking, where would they have gone without bringing Mikey? And so Rhonda continues to walk through the house into the kitchen, and when she gets there, she sees on the table are 2 plates of food where the food looks like it's a couple of days old, and it's just sitting on the plate like they had been eating it and then just abandoned it there. And then in the sink are all these dirty dishes, and then on the stove are half-cooked pots of food. And Rhonda knows her mother is an extremely tidy person, and she never would have left her house with dirty dishes and food out on the table. And so red flags are going up for Rhonda, but what ultimately sealed the deal for her was when she turned and looked on one of the counters, she saw the cell phone that Reggie and Carol shared was still sitting there along with Carol's purse, and then next to that was both of their medications, which was Reggie's insulin and Carol's liver cancer medication, both of which were life-saving and needed to be taken every single day. There's no way they would have left the house without those things. And so Rhonda immediately calls the Jacksonville Police Department and she files a missing person report. And before long, the missing couple's story is all over the news and all of the networks are asking people if they have information to come forward. But no one came forward. And so the only lead the police had was to track down the Sumner's car, which was missing from their driveway when Rhonda showed up at their house. So the police shared the description of their vehicle all across the state, and very quickly they got a hit. The car had been found abandoned in a Florida town about 1 hour west of Jacksonville. It had been parked in this semi-forested, very secluded area off of a dirt road, and there was nothing inside of it, but they saw the battery had been taken out, leading some of the officers to speculate that perhaps the Sumners really had just driven away from their home without telling anybody and then ran into car troubles. But that theory would quickly be thrown out the window when 5 hours later, the Jacksonville police received a very strange phone call. The man who called in said he was Reggie Sumner. And he said he had seen the news about him and his wife being missing and that was just totally not true, that in reality, they had left, but they were just fine and they'd be back soon. The police are immediately suspicious of this person. They don't think it's Reggie Sumner because for one, he sounds like a young man and Reggie is a 61-year-old. And so the voice didn't really line up. And just the way he was talking about this disappearance like it was no big deal, that also just didn't really make sense. And so one of the officers asked Reggie, "Are you with your wife, Carol?" And he said, "Yep, I'm with her. Here she is." And so a woman hops on the phone who says she's Carol Sumner, but she sounds far too young to be Carol Sumner, who's 61. This sounds like a 18, 19, 20-year-old girl. And she too just reiterates that everything's just fine and they've gone out for a couple of days. There's nothing to worry about. And, you police can stop looking for us. And so after this call ends, the police at this point are convinced that this simply cannot be Carol and Reggie. But to make sure, they call in Rhonda and they have her listen to the recording of this conversation with the so-called Reggie and Carol. And right away, Rhonda says, "That's not my mom and that's not Reggie." And so at this point, the police assumed that these two people who called in pretending to be the Sumners probably had something to do with the disappearance of the real Sumners. And so while they waited for the trace on this phone call to come back, which would give them information about who was calling and from where, the police decided to investigate another angle. The police looked at the Sumners' bank statements and they saw their bank card had been used at an ATM in South Carolina after the Sumners had been reported missing. And so they called that bank and they asked for the CCTV footage from that ATM. And when they watched it, they saw that it was not Carol or Reggie Sumner withdrawing funds. It was some unknown man in his early 20s. Right after this discovery of this unknown man, the trace from the phone conversation with the imposter Sumners came back, except it was tied to a fake name at a fake address. So that wasn't helpful to the police in their investigation. However, when they went through this cell phone's call logs, which they got with the phone trace, they saw whoever owned the cell phone had recently placed a call to a car rental company in South Carolina. And so the police call this car rental company and they speak to the manager and they're able to figure out that somebody using this cell phone number had indeed called and had rented a car, and the car they rented matched the description of the car the unknown man was driving in the ATM surveillance footage. But this car had been rented to a woman. Her name was Tiffany Cole. The rental company told police that all of their cars had satellite tracking information built into them. And so police were able to use that information to track Tiffany's rental car to a motel in South Carolina. The initial thought was that maybe the Sumners are being held against their will in this motel. And so very quickly, a police force was organized, and on the morning of July 14th, so 6 days after the Sumners were listed as missing, they arrive at this motel, they go to the front desk, they find out what room Tiffany is in, they get the key, and they go up and they open the door. The Sumners were not inside. Instead, there were 3 young adults sitting there. It was 24-year-old Tiffany Cole, her boyfriend, 23-year-old Michael James Jackson, and his friend, 19-year-old Alan Wade. Also in the room were dozens of bags of recently purchased merchandise, like computers and video games and clothes and perfume. And also they discovered the key to the Sumners' vehicle and Reggie Sumner's prized coin collection. The police brought all 3 back to the police station and put them in separate rooms to be interrogated. At this point, it was obvious to police that these 3 had something to do with the Sumners' disappearance. They had all these things in the room that tied them to the missing couple. And so now the police, as they interrogated them, it was not so much about connecting them to the Sumners as much as it was about helping them find the Sumners. At first, all 3 of them either didn't talk or were totally uncooperative. But under intense questioning, Tiffany cracked a little bit. She said that they had robbed the Sumners, but nothing more. They didn't do anything else besides rob them. And there had been a 4th person involved in the robbery, 19-year-old Bruce Nixon, who was friends with Alan Wade. Bruce lived nearby, so the police quickly rounded him up and brought him in for questioning, and unlike the other 3, Bruce immediately caved. And the story he told about what happened to the Sumners brought many of the police that were involved in this investigation to tears. He said it all started with Tiffany. Tiffany used to be neighbors with the Sumners back when they still lived in South Carolina. Tiffany had a pretty rough upbringing and her father was permanently sick. And so the Sumners kind of took her under their wing and looked after her and built a very close relationship with her and kind of treated her like she was one of their daughters. Anything she needed, if she needed money, food, anything, they would give it to her. For example, in 2001, right before they left for Florida, they sold a car to Tiffany, but they sold it for basically nothing because they knew she didn't have any money and she really needed a car. 4 years later, in June of 2005, Tiffany was partying in Jacksonville, Florida with her new boyfriend, Michael James Jackson, when they got kicked out of the house they planned on staying in for the night. And so now they don't have a place to stay, they don't have any money, and that's when Tiffany remembers the Sumners had moved to Jacksonville and they would always help her out if she needed anything. And so the 2 of them drive to the Sumners' house in the middle of the night, they haven't called them, and they just knock on the door, totally uninvited. And Carol comes to the door, and when she opens it, she sees Tiffany, and immediately she's like, "Oh my goodness, I haven't seen you in so long. Come in, come in. Who are you? Oh, Michael, great to meet you. Come on inside, I'll get you food. We'll get you fed. What do you need? What can we do for you?" And so that's when Tiffany explains to them that their plans had kind of fallen through and they didn't have a place to stay that night, and would it be possible to stay with them? And so Carol and Reggie right away say, absolutely no problem. Tiffany, Michael, you guys are guests here. You're welcome. Stay as long as you want. And so that night, Carol cooked a big meal for them and they all sat down at the table. And at some point, Carol and Reggie talk about the sale of their house in South Carolina. And somehow it came up that they had made $99,000 in profit from this sale. And they were so happy about it because now they could really retire comfortably. And so as soon as they said that, Tiffany and Michael shot glances at each other because they knew they had to come back and rob them. The next morning, Carol and Reggie got up early. They made coffee and they made breakfast. And they were hoping that Tiffany and Michael would stick around for the day and spend some more time with them. But Tiffany and Michael were very quick to want to leave. They said, thank you very much. We got to hit the road. And so they left. And as soon as they get in the car, they start planning how they're going to come back and rob the Sumners and get their hands on that $99,000. 1 month later, on the evening of July 8th, after all robbery preparations have been made, Bruce Nixon and Alan Wade show up at the Sumner house and they knock on the door. When the door opens, it's Carol, and she doesn't recognize either of them, but being as kind and generous as she was, she said, hey boys, what can I do for you? How can I help you? And this was exactly what Bruce and Alan were expecting based on what Tiffany told them. She said this couple would be very easy to exploit. And they tell her that their car had broken down and they needed to use her phone. And so she's a little bit skeptical, but ultimately she says, sure, come on in. And so Bruce and Alan go inside the house, the door shuts behind them, and as soon as it does, one of them draws a fake gun that looks very real and pointed it at Carol, while the other one began tying her up with cord and with duct tape. And so Carol begins screaming and making a bunch of noise, and Reggie, who's in the garage out of sight, he hears her. He comes running in to see what's going on, and he sees these two men who immediately attack him, and Reggie's got a broken leg, and he's already pretty weak and frail, and so he doesn't put up much of a fight. And before long, he and his wife were all taped up and restrained on the couch, and they were having duct tape wrapped around their heads until everything was covered except for a slit underneath their nose so they could breathe. And so with the couple completely under control and at the mercy of their captors, one of the men texted Michael, who was down the road with Tiffany inside of Tiffany's rental car, and the text just said, all clear. And what that meant was Michael could now come up and help them rob the house. And so Tiffany stays down the road in the rental car. Michael makes his way up. He goes inside, and he, Bruce, and Alan proceeded to ransack the house. And while these three men are moving room to room, taking all of their valuables, Reggie and Carol are probably thinking to themselves that, you know what, this is awful, we're getting robbed, but after they take whatever they take and they leave, we'll be fine, we'll recover. But when these three men finished taking all of their valuable items, they decided that they would also take Reggie and Carol. So they stood the couple up and they marched them into the garage and they put them in the trunk of their own car. At this point, Bruce left the Sumner's house and went down the road and got in Tiffany's rental car, and Michael and Alan, they got into the Sumner's car, and the two cars met up on the road and then drove 40 minutes northwest just over the border into Georgia, where they found this access road and they went down it until they reached this very secluded section of forest. This was not just some random spot in the middle of the woods in Georgia. This was a pre-selected spot that Tiffany and the others had been out to 2 days earlier to prepare it. And what they had done to prepare was to dig a grave for the Sumners. Michael and Alan, in the Sumner's car, drove up right next to the gravesite, while Tiffany and Bruce came up right behind them. And once they'd all stopped, they got out of the car and they went right behind the Sumner's car and they popped open the trunk. It's believed the temperature inside of that trunk was well over 100 degrees. And so Reggie and Carol were sweating profusely, and the sweat had caused their restraints to slip off their wrists and slip down off their face. And so the two of them were found holding on to each other and crying and praying. Seeing how weak they already were, the group decided they did not need to put new tape around their wrists or their face. They weren't going to go anywhere. And so they grabbed the two and they pulled them out and dumped them on the ground. It was probably around this time that the Sumners realized Tiffany was one of these four people that was doing this horrible thing to them. And I can only imagine the heartbreak they experienced. This girl that they took in under their wing, that they thought of as a daughter, was betraying them in such a heinous and horrible way. But there was no time to feel upset about it, because as soon as they were dumped on the ground, Michael grabbed Reggie and kind of threw him over to the side and said, sit down, don't move, or I'm going to kill you and your wife. And then the others grabbed Carol and dragged her away from her husband over to the edge of the grave, where they literally ripped the jewelry off of her face and off of her body. And then after all the jewelry was gone, they pushed her into the grave. Then they walked over to Reggie and dragged him over and threw him in with his wife.
As soon as the couple was in the grave together, they repositioned themselves so they were both sitting up, one in front of the other, with Carol behind Reggie, and she threw her legs and her arms around Reggie, just kind of clutching onto him, and she buried her head into his back and she began crying. The original plan, apparently, had been to take the Sumners and put them in this grave and pretend like you were going to do something to them to scare them into giving up all of their information, all of their banking information, and anything else that was valuable. And it worked. And so as Carol is crying into Reggie's back, Reggie is pleading with the group. He's pleading to them, let me give you everything I have. Whatever you need, it's yours. And so Michael said, give me all your ATM bank card numbers, give me your PIN numbers, everything. And so Reggie did. He gave him all the information he could possibly give to him. And then, for some reason, despite the fact that at this point, the group has taken everything of value from this poor couple. They have extracted all the valuable information they could possibly get from them. Despite that, they decide that that's not enough. They need to kill the Sumners. And they need to kill them in the worst way imaginable. They need to bury them alive. For hours, the group slowly, shovelful by shovelful, filled in this hole with Reggie and Carol sitting at the bottom begging for their lives. But the group didn't care at all. They just kept shoveling dirt down on top of them until the dirt and mud had gotten up to their necks, and the weight of the dirt was pressing in on their chests and was making it really hard to breathe. And so as Carol and Reggie are feeling this happening to them, they can feel themselves being crushed under this weight. Their cries for help become more and more desperate, but more spaced apart because their breathing at this point is so labored. It's so hard to get a full breath that they're conserving their air at this point. And then at some point, as the dirt crept closer and closer to their mouths, they had to tilt their heads up to try to get a good breath of air. But when they did that, they began shoveling dirt directly onto their faces, causing them to choke and gag. They're inhaling this, and it's becoming nearly impossible to catch a breath. They're dying at this point. And so finally, another layer of dirt was thrown on top of them, and they disappeared under the soil. But their sounds didn't go away. They continued to whimper and make sounds as more and more dirt was put down, until finally they had filled in the hole, and they began packing the dirt down with the backs of their shovels. And they could hear underneath the soil still the sounds of this couple dying. This was a slow and horrible death. After the killers were done, they left the site and they took the Sumner's car and they dumped it in Florida, where it was ultimately found. And then they all piled into the rental car. They went to an ATM and pulled some of the Sumner's money out, and then went on a spending spree. During that spending spree, Tiffany would pose for several pictures in the back of the rental car. In these photos, Tiffany is all smiles and clearly having a wonderful time, despite the fact that literally just hours earlier she had killed the very people who had taken her in and treated her like a daughter. If you want to see those pictures, just Google the words Tiffany Cole celebrating. After their autopsies, the medical examiner explained that both Reggie and Carol had dirt packed into their nose, into their mouths, in their throats, in their stomach, and in their lungs, meaning their actual cause of death was being buried alive. In exchange for telling investigators what happened and for leading them to the gravesite where the Sumners were, Bruce Nixon was spared the death penalty and given a life sentence. As for Michael, Alan, and Tiffany, they were all sentenced to death. Thank you. Around 9 p.m. on December 29, 1980, a 57-year-old woman named Vicki Landrum rode in the front seat of her friend Betty Cash's car, while her 7-year-old grandson, named Colby, who she was raising, sat between them. The three of them had just had dinner at a truck stop and were now on their way home, driving down a dark wooded highway near Huffman, Texas, which is a small town about 30 miles northeast of Houston. As they drove down the road, Vicki began to notice the windshield was fogging up from how cold it was outside and how warm it was inside the car. And so Vicki turned on the defroster. And as the windshield began to clear, Vicki noticed this bright light right out in front of them up over the trees. And at first, Vicki just figured, they were close to the Houston airport, and so that light must just be an airplane. But as the trio continued driving down this winding highway road, that light that Vicki really thought was a plane landing appeared to just kind of hover in the trees. And actually, as they drove, the light almost appeared to get closer and closer to them. So it didn't really seem like it was a plane.
Now, at first, Vicky thought this was just kind of interesting and was curious about this light. But as they got closer and closer to this light, it became very obvious that the inside of the car was getting much warmer and stuffier than any of the heat settings would allow it to get, to the point where Vicky was actually sweating and panting from the heat. Now, all of this was happening really quickly, and so Vicky sort of went from being curious to being kind of anxious. Like, what was going on here? Like, does this light have something to do with the heat they're experiencing in the car? And then all of a sudden, the light that appeared to be sort of behind the trees suddenly came right out in front of the car, and Vicky screamed at Betty, "Stop!" And Becky jammed on the brakes, and they came to a stop, and blocking their path, maybe 100 feet in front of them, just hovering over the road, is this strange looking aircraft aimed right at them. This craft was the strange light. For a moment, all three of them just stared in shock at this craft, like it was so unexpected and so unbelievable that this had happened. But then Vicky, who's sitting there still panting and sweating, she's looking out and she's realizing this craft she's looking at looks nothing like any other aircraft she had ever seen. The craft was a bit bigger than a car, it was diamond shaped, and it was letting out these strange loud roaring sounds, almost like an engine. It appeared to be glowing red hot, and periodically, with those loud roaring sounds it was making, fire would appear to shoot out the bottom of the craft, scorching the pavement right under it. And again, this strange craft is just hovering there right over the ground, appeared to be aimed directly at Vicky, Betty, and Colby. Pretty quickly, Colby began to cry. He was scared. But Betty, the driver, she said she couldn't go anywhere. The road was too thin. She couldn't really turn around very easily, and she couldn't drive straight and go under the craft and risk being burned by the flames. And so they were just kind of trapped there. And so Vicky and Betty sort of looked at each other like, okay, we're gonna wait it out and hope this craft just eventually flies away. But after several minutes, and the craft still had not departed, it was still blocking their way and periodically spitting fire into the ground, Vicky and Betty are like, well, let's get out and see what's going on here. Let's investigate. By this point, their fear and anxiety around this had sort of been replaced by just genuine human curiosity. I mean, what the heck is this thing? And so Betty, the driver, she gets out, and Vicky, she tells her grandson, stay in the car, so Colby's right here, and Vicky gets out, and the second she does, and she now has an unobstructed view at this craft, she suddenly remembered this Bible verse. So Vicky was very religious, and she had read in the Bible that one day Jesus would return to the earth, and when he did, he would return in a rain of fire. And so all of a sudden, Vicky believed that what she was looking at was not some aircraft, but the second coming of Jesus Christ. This was like a highly spiritual moment for her. But just as Vicky was about to go forward and actually inspect this thing up close, she heard Colby call out for her. He was crying hysterically. He was totally scared and upset. And so this kind of broke Vicky out of her trance. She turned around and went back to the car to comfort Colby. And when she got back to the car, she found Colby scrunched up on the floor underneath the dashboard like he was trying to shield himself from this craft. And so Vicky, she got right down there with him. She wrapped her arms around Colby and began praying with him to try to calm him down. But while Vicky and Colby were praying inside the car, Betty remained outside of the car, just staring at this craft. And it went on like this for about 10 minutes until Vicky, who's still tucked down there with Colby, heard that roaring sound coming from the aircraft get noticeably louder, like it was about to do something. And so Vicky poked her head up and she looked out the windshield, and sure enough, this craft was beginning to take off. It was getting higher and higher off the ground. Flames were shooting out the bottom of it. Betty was still outside staring at it. And then before long, this craft had shot straight up into the air and began taking off up and away from them at a really steep angle. And at the same time, Vicky suddenly saw this swarm of all these helicopters, these military-style helicopters, go right up around this craft, like they were escorting it. And then the craft and all these helicopters took off into the horizon and disappeared. After they were all gone, Vicky realized that what she had just witnessed was not the second coming of Christ. Because of these military helicopters that arrived as this craft took off, it told Vicky and also Betty that very likely this was just a US military exercise of some sort. And so a few moments later, Betty came back to the car and sat in the driver's seat, and Vicky, she climbed back into her seat and lifted Colby up to the middle seat as well. And for a moment, the three of them just sat there in silence. I mean, there's nothing blocking their way anymore. They're just sort of trying to process what just happened. Eventually, Betty just put the car in drive and began driving straight ahead, crossing right over that scorch mark on the pavement where the craft had been. About 45 minutes later, Betty pulled up to Vicky's house and parked the car. Vicky and Colby, they got out, they said goodbye to Betty. They didn't really talk about what they had just seen, they just said goodnight. And then Vicky and Colby headed inside the house. And as much as both of them did have things to say about whatever it was they saw, they just continued not to talk about it. They both were just kind of eager to go to bed. However, as Vicky was putting Colby to bed, he began to complain that his stomach hurt, and at the same time, Vicky began to realize that she also didn't feel very well. And shortly after that, both of them were vomiting in the bathroom. And this scared Vicky. She tried to tell herself that, maybe the reason they were sick is because they ate some bad food at that truck stop. But deep down, Vicky was very concerned that their nausea was somehow connected to that strange craft. And so it was a very long night, with Vicky and Colby being nauseous most of the time, but eventually they both did fall asleep. And then when Vicky got up the next morning, she still felt awful. And so Vicky, she rolled out of bed and made her way to the bathroom. And when she looked at herself in the mirror, she gasped. Her skin was bright red and blistered, like she had had this horrible sunburn. At this point, she knew whatever was going on here, it had to do with that craft. She just knew it. And so Vicky instinctively rushed to Colby's room to check on him to see if his skin was all blistered and red, and she found he was still sleeping, but she could see his skin was red and blistered in some places, but not nearly as bad as Vicky's. And so Vicky, she began thinking about the night before, and she remembered she had gotten out of the car and gotten closer to the craft. So she was sort of more exposed to the craft, if you will, than Colby, who stayed in the car and tucked himself down underneath the dashboard the whole time. And so maybe Vicky's exposure to the craft was higher than Colby's, which is why she looked worse. But as Vicky was thinking this through, she remembered that Betty had actually stayed outside the car for 10-15 minutes, much longer than Vicky had, the whole time just staring directly at this craft. And so immediately Vicky was worried that, if this is what happened to me, I can only imagine what shape Betty is in. And so Vicky ran to the phone, she picked it up and she dialed Betty's number, and she listened, and it just kept on ringing and ringing. Betty didn't answer. Now, at this point, Vicky was in a full-blown panic, not only because she was worried about Betty, but also, she doesn't really know what's wrong with her or with Colby. She doesn't know if their sickness is going to get worse or better. Currently, she felt horrible. She was nauseous. Her skin seemed to be practically falling off. Colby was in less bad shape, but still not healthy. And also, Vicky didn't have the money to even go to the doctor to get looked at. And so as much as Vicky really wanted right now to just go check on Betty, go drive to her house and check on her, she couldn't. She needed to focus on herself and her grandson first and make sure they were okay before she did anything else. And so over the next few days, Vicky and Colby stayed home. They slowly regained their strength. And over those few days, Vicky actually would get Betty on the phone. And Betty would tell her that yes, she's also dealing with similar symptoms, but she was okay, which was very reassuring to Vicky. However, Vicky also knew that Betty was not a complainer, and even if she did have horrendous symptoms, she was not the type of person who would necessarily tell Vicky. She would sort of tough it out. Finally, after 5 days, Vicky felt strong enough to go check on Betty in person. However, when she got to Betty's house and went inside, she called out for Betty, but there was no answer. The house was eerily quiet, and so Vicky began walking around Betty's house looking for Betty. And eventually, Vicky walked down a hallway and reached Betty's bedroom, and the door was shut. Vicky called out for Betty, but there was no answer from inside. And so feeling kind of scared at this point, Vicky reached down, she turned the handle and opened the door, and immediately she saw Betty on her bed. And Betty looked horrible. She was barely conscious. Her entire body was red and blistered and bleeding. There was vomit all over the bed sheets, and there were all these huge clumps of Betty's hair littering her pillow. And so Vicky was horrified. She rushed inside, she scooped her friend up, and between the two of them, they kind of hobbled out of the house. Vicky put Betty in her car, and they sped to the hospital. A few hours later, Vicky was waiting in the emergency room where Betty was being treated when Betty's doctor walked into the waiting room, at which point Vicky stood up and rushed over to him and said, "Hey, what's going on with Betty? What happened to her? What's going on?" But the doctor just shook his head and said, your friend, her skin is literally peeling off her face in sheets, and there are blisters breaking out all over her body. He told Vicky that her symptoms reminded him of radiation poisoning. However, he also told Vicky that that was basically impossible. For Betty, a woman who lives in rural Texas, where would she go to come in contact with something that radioactive? It just seemed not possible, so that couldn't be it. But Vicky, when she heard this, felt like she knew exactly how Betty came in contact with something highly radioactive. It had to be that craft.
And so without even thinking about it, Vicky began pouring out the story of how her and Betty had seen this light, and then this craft appeared on the road, and it was shooting fire, and then it flew off with helicopters all around it. But as she was wrapping up her story, Vicky was suddenly overcome with embarrassment because the doctor was now staring at her like she was totally out of her mind. A month later, in early February of 1981, Vicky was at her kitchen table with the phone pressed to her ear. She was calling her local senator, who she had already written to try to tell him about this strange aircraft she had seen that made her friend sick. But Vicky did not have high hopes about this phone call, because she had already been ignored so many times by so many people when it came to this story. So by this point, Vicky and her grandson Colby had basically recovered from their nausea and their burns. However, Betty had not recovered. She was still cycling in and out of the hospital. She was in constant pain. She still had burns all over her. And in fact, because of all these symptoms, she had had to move in with her brother. Now, Vicky was certain that all these symptoms Betty had were radiation sickness caused by the radiation from this aircraft they came in contact with. But it was like everybody they told about this aircraft didn't believe them. Just then, Vicky heard a woman's voice break through the hold music. It was the local senator's secretary. And so Vicky quickly explained why she was calling and why she really wanted to talk to the local senator. But the secretary just told Vicky that, yep, she'll pass this along to the senator and he'll be in touch. And then she hung up. And for Vicky, this was the moment she snapped. She felt like trying to navigate the proper channels to try to figure out what this aircraft was and what happened to Betty was not working, because clearly nobody was taking her seriously. And so Vicky slammed the phone down and just sat there frustrated, having no idea what to do. But as she sat there, Vicky remembered there was actually one place she had not called yet, specifically because she didn't want to call this place. It was a UFO research center. And Vicky hadn't called because she did not believe the craft she had seen was a UFO. She believed it was a military aircraft because she had seen the helicopters escorting it away, and that made the most sense. It had to be military. But if she called the UFO research center and people found out about that, it would make her look even crazier, because now she's claiming the craft was aliens or something. But now Vicky felt like she had run out of options. So she picked up the phone, grabbed a piece of paper with a number on it, and dialed. A couple days later, a scientist named John Schuessler drove down the winding wooded highway into Huffman, Texas. He was going to meet up with Vicky. John was an aerospace engineer for NASA. However, he also spent a lot of time investigating UFO sightings. Vicky's call to that UFO research center had created a lot of excitement in the UFO community, and the story had eventually found its way to John, who decided he would take on the case. Now, to be clear, John was not into researching UFO sightings in order to prove they really happened. Actually, it was sort of the opposite. He would look into reported UFO sightings in order to prove they were not UFOs. He would find a rational, scientific explanation that debunked the sighting. That's sort of what he did. And so with Vicky's case, that was his intention, to go to Huffman, Texas, talk to Vicky, and explain away with science and rationale what happened here. That this was not, aliens. This was something ordinary, like a government aircraft. And so John eventually got to Vicky's house, and he went inside and he chatted with Vicky, and she talked him through all the details of the story. And then eventually they both left Vicky's house, they hopped in their respective cars and headed out to go to the actual site where this had happened. And when they got there and John got out of the car, he didn't need Vicky to direct him to the specific site, because right in front of him was this really obvious black circle right in the middle of the road, as if the road itself had been melted and then re-solidified and actually looked different. And Vicky said, that's where it was. That's where the craft was hovering. Those marks are from the craft. Now, this was great evidence that a craft really had been here, but John wanted more. He needed to figure out what kind of craft this really was. And so he told Vicky he was going to leave and go canvass the area for witnesses, and he told her he would keep her updated. So Vicky left, and John drove up the road until he reached some campsites and farmhouses. And John systematically went from door to door and tent to tent, asking anybody if they had seen or heard any aircraft or anything strange on the night of December 29th. Now, going into this, John didn't really know what to expect from these people he was asking. I mean, he's some random scientist showing up uninvited at people's homes, asking if they've seen strange lights in the sky. However, every single person he spoke to said that yes, they had seen that aircraft on December 29th.
However, they were obviously just farther away than Vicky and Betty and Colby had been. So now, John felt like he had enough information to speak directly with military officials. However, when he contacted all the military bases in the area, all those officials he spoke to told him absolutely that on December 29th, there were 0 military operations happening. John found this very frustrating because to him, it seemed very clear that these officials were just lying to him. But what they were lying about and why was unclear. So John actually went to these military bases to speak to the officials face to face. And when he did, he showed them all the witness testimonies saying what they had seen on December 29th. And he also told them that with his own eyes, he had seen the black scorched mark on the pavement, where the pavement seemed to have literally melted in a ring and re-solidified from the heat of this craft. And to John, I mean, that scorch mark almost proved something had been there, very likely a military craft. But all these military leaders, despite hearing this and hearing John's testimony, they just said, you know what, you can gather up all the evidence you think you have here, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't prove that we were in the area. There was no military craft there that night. And so the bottom line was, the military was adamant they were not involved. And so the case really began to stall. John went home, but he couldn't stop thinking about the case, and so he kept in touch with his witnesses and periodically checked in with military officials, but nothing seemed to change. Except that Betty continued to get sicker and sicker, and Vicky actually began to develop other serious symptoms, like developing cataracts in one of her eyes. And then John got a frantic call from one of his witnesses. They told him they had just seen something truly incredible. And as John listened to the story, he felt his heart sink, because now he knew the military had been lying to him about being out there on December 29th. Clearly they had been, and very likely it was their aircraft that had made Betty, Vicky, and Colby so sick. But now, John also knew that any hope he had of proving this was now literally gone, because the witness told him that black government vehicles had rolled up to the incident site out on that road, and they'd come along with construction vehicles, and for no clear traffic-related reason, they had cut up one particular stretch of that road, taken it with them, and left. And that particular stretch of road that was removed just happened to be the exact spot where that scorch mark had been left by the craft. It was like they were taking the evidence and getting rid of it. Now, John himself was not able to literally go back to the road and see for himself where the pavement had been cut. However, not long after John learned this information, a group of UFO scientists descended on the road to find this scorch mark, or to prove it had been cut out and taken away like the witness had said. And sure enough, when they got out there, they didn't find the scorch mark. Instead, they found nice, fresh, brand new pavement. The strange event that Vicky, Betty, and Colby experienced on the night of December 29, 1980, is widely considered to be one of the most famous and credible UFO sightings of all time. It's now known as the Cache Landrum incident, after Betty and Vicky's last names, and to this day, nobody has been able to come up with a rational explanation for what happened if it wasn't a UFO. To this day, the US government maintains that they did not have any military operations happening on December 29th. However, they did say when it comes to cutting out the road and paving over it, that that was just for routine maintenance. They were not trying to hide evidence. As for Vicky and Betty, over the years, their health continued to deteriorate. They ultimately filed a lawsuit against the government, but because they couldn't actually prove that the aircraft even existed or that it caused their health problems, their lawsuit was ultimately dismissed. Both women would eventually die from cancer, which Colby believes is a direct result from radiation exposure. As for Colby, he's still alive and continuing to seek answers.
Thank you for listening to the Mrballen podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please go into the 5-star review button's favorite music playlist
and replace all of the songs with the Kids Bop versions of them. Also, please subscribe to the Mrballen podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, and everywhere else you get your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories I have posted on my YouTube